So, welcome to part 2 of our special Time for Impact podcast digital edition featuring guest speakers from Volunteero and EBM.AI, Ashley Staines and Doug Ayres. I hope you had the opportunity to listen to part 1 of this mini series. I'd recommend perhaps listen to that before you listen to this, although it's entirely up to you. Whichever way you listen to it, I'm sure you'll find lots of value and lots of insights and lots of new ways to think about volunteering and digital in your professional activities. Hope you enjoy it. Here's the episode. I wanted to change tack because we started on this earlier on, but the sector in general and volunteering in particular do seem to be incredibly data poor in terms of what they know about their volunteers. I can't remember, I think it was Doug who was talking about, she was talking about knowing who the lawyers were and so on in your organisation. It seems so obvious that it almost doesn't seem worth mentioning. But I come across so many charities who fail to get the investment in volunteer management systems, or in your case, chatbots as well, which help with the analysis of data and so on. And they just don't understand their customers. And if you don't understand your customers, it seems very difficult for me to how you can have a marketing approach to getting volunteers involved in your organisation, as opposed to somebody else's organisation, as opposed to watching television, watching the football, watching Netflix, going to the pub, which are all competitions for their time. And then if you want to, as you've said, diversify into different groups of volunteers, different demographics, all of that requires some marketing thinking. And it seems incredibly difficult to do that if you don't know your volunteers or your prospective volunteers. So, I'd just be interested in your take on that. I'll let you take it where you want to take it.
Yeah, typically you need, I would say, some degree of tech to provide you the data that you need, right? Even if that's to the very basic level of SurveyMonkey to gather some data on your volunteers and how they find things and their experience. But you've got organizations potentially going to their board asking for a system, and for them to value that, they want to know the data and why volunteering is so important and why they should optimize it. But they need the system to do that. And so they're kind of caught in this catch-22 scenario sometimes. But absolutely. We recently published a sort of a guide to putting together a volunteer strategy. And the first point always is understand your volunteering. And that means data, right? And so if it's your very first time even doing something like this, at least an annual survey, at least exit surveys, maybe to kind of just understand how your current cohort find things, why people are leaving, and that's going to give you at least enough to go off and make sort of informed decisions going forward. And so, I really don't want to be someone who's saying you always need a volunteering system, because you don't, because I think most could do this for free using free tools, but it's just, making a start and kind of pressing on with some sort of smaller initiatives and building on that kind of data that you're putting together for sure.
A volunteering platform, obviously there's tiers of how you use it or the amount of people, but when you get it's worth that financial investment versus the time investment trying to figure out the tools you're going to stitch together to use it. But maybe some organizations will never learn, but there's a reason that someone has spent 3.5 years and a lot of blood, sweat and tears, and probably quite a lot of design thinking and a lot of conversations with the target audience to go, these are the things we need to do, and you don't have to use them all, but it'll do this, it'll do all of it, but you can use it for this and it will be worth it. I kind of want to ask a question myself, probably to Matt or maybe to Chris, but sort of flip it on to the interviewers' heads. What are the top 3 red tape bullet points that you know of outside of it's not as important as fundraising?
Like an obvious one, which I imagine, and this links us into recruitment, right, that is probably pertinent for almost all volunteering, like formal volunteering involving organisations, that is distinct from a sort of mutual aid community base is like what a lot of us would probably call sort of like safe recruitment and enrollment practices. So the fact that you need to capture someone's data, put it into a system somewhere, store that safely, probably do some referencing in lots of cases, maybe not, but lots of us will do referencing. In some instances, we'll do disclosure checking. Some of us will do interviews. Some of us will do even more than that. And all of that stuff is built in, I guess, in my experience at least, because we've all sat here and heard the horror stories of what happens when you don't do that sometimes, and some of our organizations have experienced it and live with the challenges of it, and being called out by legislators to do better and to check these things safely. The challenge is that means that we need to, I suppose sometimes, right, it's not about whether we do those things or not. It's about how we make those things as easy as possible as part of the experience. And you can make those things very easy, but you can also make them very complicated and long-winded. So that's an obvious one for me. The other obvious one, I suppose, in a digital sense, is training volunteers, like from volunteers, a volunteer's perception of like red tape, I suppose, how they, like, so you're enthusiastic, you're ready to go. How do we help you know what you need to know really, really quickly and in a way that's comfortable and easy and smooth and not like this kind of thing that people like me almost feel like they need to apologize for. It's like, oh, you're here, great, thanks for your time. I'm really sorry, you've got to do some of this training. But I'd love those conversations to be like, oh, great, you're here, and we've got this fantastic training that's going to be really easy to access. It's going to really support you, help you do what you want to do really quickly. I guess I've dedicated large parts of my career in various points trying to make that piece easier, but I'm not sure we always cracked it, and I'm not sure everyone I've always been involved in will necessarily have thought that made things easier. Maybe it did for some people. I don't know, Chris, I've done two. I don't know, you might have a third.
Well, I don't know if it's the third one or not, but for me, it's a whole mindset issue, really. And it comes back in my head to this concept that we think of volunteers as resources, not customers. And if you think of the resources, you want to control the resource. And therefore, your mindset is all about controlling activities. Whereas I often think about volunteering much more in the customer kind of framing, in which case I'm more interested in convening and curating experiences. And I think if you get your head in that curating worthwhile experiences that people come back for time and time again, then I think the whole load of your mindset shift means that you look at all these things generally in a different framing in terms of risk, and that probably changes the activity. And I think a lot of volunteering professionals get that. But again, like going right back to the beginning of our conversation, I think it's quite difficult often to explain that in a few words to your CEO, to your board, and to your colleagues across the organisation. And I know for a lot of heads of volunteering and volunteering professionals, they feel that they're constantly trying to have those conversations, and it's a cultural change exercise, and it doesn't happen overnight. You just, I'm afraid, have to be planned about it and be very, very tenacious about getting those messages across, and it takes time. Ash?
I was having this conversation with somebody actually the other evening, and I think there's unfortunately complacency at the kind of exec level. I think a lot of the time, right, these volunteers are here, they'll always be here, and that kind of thing, and then volunteer professionals have to fill the gaps and make sure that that's always the case, right, with very limited resources at their disposal. And I wonder if it comes back to one of the points you mentioned earlier as well, Chris, is sometimes maybe the types of folks that are in these volunteer management positions, like, and Matt said, they're people, and absolutely they are, right? And are they, maybe they don't feel quite as comfortable, really shouting the loudest. And sometimes you have to be the ones that shouts the loudest within the organization to get people to focus on what you're doing. And it's a real tough one, but maybe there's just maybe some education with them in changing that messaging. It's not just, this is how many hours our volunteers do, right? But it's maybe kind of switching it on its head and just saying, if all of our volunteers went on strike tomorrow, right? If volunteers did that, right? I'm not encouraging that were to happen. What would happen, right? How would our volunteering, how would our organization continue to operate? And I think it's kind of almost getting that into the heads of the execs and understanding, like, you are complacent with this. We are, like you said, Chris, I love that idea of thinking of them as the customer. It's the exact way we think about it with Volunteero, right? Is we want to give our clients a competitive advantage. Sure, we're all charities and we're all trying to do good things, but you are competing for their time, right? Which is the most valuable resource every human being has. And so how are you going to make sure they want to spend their time with you? And are you really putting the resources into kind of making that happen? So yeah, I wonder if there's, more ways we can kind of give tools and ideas to volunteer managers to how to reposition the conversation with the execs to make them listen, and how to have those difficult conversations that need to be had. And I hope, as well, we start to see more heads of volunteering going on to sort of boards of directors and things as well, because we need to have that voice on the senior leadership team.
I wonder if, in the context of barriers, I would consider myself very fortunate that everywhere I've always been involved, there's been a pretty open door and good appreciation for volunteers, and I really value and think that's really important. But I do know that some people do experience that as a barrier in terms of innovation and forward thinking, making things better and making things more efficient. And I'm interested in this customer mindset, because if you've got executives on one hand, like, certainly one of the areas I have experienced barriers is almost in volunteers themselves, particularly kind of longer serving, quite entrenched volunteers, where they might have a particular view of what this experience of volunteering is supposed to be like, and that often is not a very digital one. And trying to innovate or introduce digital in a way that sets organizations up for the future, in a way that makes things more efficient for future generations or digital natives, I guess sometimes has felt like a barrier. I'm interested in your take on that. I suppose, is there a generational divide on this when it comes to volunteering in digital? Is that real? What's the answer to overcoming this? I guess, some of that reticence of driving through change at whatever level in an organization might not just be through lack of skills or through lack of valuing or wanting to invest in volunteers. It might be almost the opposite of, I don't want to upset these volunteers, and therefore I don't want to upset the status quo by introducing a new approach that might be digitally driven. I don't know, interested in thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, we hear that all the time, right? I think, when sometimes we'll be on calls and we mention app and you see sort of the fear in people's eyes, right? Oh no, my volunteers are going to really kick off with that one, and yeah, yes, it is a fear that is fairly unanimous across the sector. I would say, if I'm honest, not to try to generalize, but there's certain types of subsectors that are more prevalent to that. And I think it's typically if your volunteer base is maybe a bit older, in the heritage space, for example, right? What we have found is those fears are typically overstated. The reason, and I'm not at all, no one would be surprised why that probably is. And, I hate to bring everything back to COVID, but, that changed people's mindsets, and people figured out a way to learn how to use FaceTime to talk to their family, how to order things online, those kinds of things, right? And we know that just because we see, the broad spectrum of who's using our app, and the vast majority are over the age of 55, and it spans up to 96 as our oldest user. Now, that's still, not to say that there won't be people that are fearful when an app comes in, but I think it's important as technology providers that we build fail-safes in for that. It has to work for everybody. We don't ever want to exclude anybody. So, for example, how we do things is, we provide the best possible app. We provide the best possible user experience to run as fast as the slowest runner, so to speak. But also we provide our organizations with ways that they can overlay that with the sort of manual element that they can put in place if somebody decides they're not interested. What I sometimes do, and not wanting to sometimes fearmonger sometimes, but I feel it's my duty to kind of say, you're worried about potentially the 2 or 3 max percent of volunteers which might kick off about an hour. What about the 50% that could be kicking off soon because of the fact you don't facilitate things through some kind of tech platform? And I think sometimes, we get our mindset a little bit too skewed about those that might be shouting the loudest, but actually, it's that sort of 80-20 rule where you hear that the people that shout the loudest are often a small fraction. And it's the ones that aren't shouting, but maybe just slowly deciding they don't want to volunteer because it's painful because of X, Y, Z. That's the ones you maybe want to be worried about. And guess what? That proportion is going to be growing ever larger and larger as we move into just more everyone's a digital native, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think we often think about, I don't know, say somebody who's 65. I think we have the mindset that they're the same as a 65-year-old who retired 10, 15, 20 years ago. But actually, a lot of these, certainly the internet has been around for, 20, 30 years? We've kind of, there are a whole generation of retirees now who are pretty digitally native anyway. My father's generation in their 80s, it's a little bit more of a challenge for them, perhaps, because they retired about the time all this was happening. But even then, they're on their Zooms and their Facebooks and on various different watching Netflix and stuff. They're used to it. The world is digital now, so I'm more worried in some sense those who are digitally excluded because of economic situation. But I think a good charity will provide alternatives anyway, hopefully, to engage people, which might include on those occasions providing care, I suppose, as well. So I think we ought to, as soon as we have your two digital gurus in the studio with us today, we ought to ask the question about, maybe it's an interrelated question around AI, because I think some people view AI and digital development as a sort of existential threat to their jobs or to volunteering itself, to data privacy and so on. Let's start there. What's your thoughts on how we can ensure in the volunteering sphere that AI is a force for good rather than a force for ill?
I'll take this one. I've been talking about labor arbitrage and the explosion of AI for about 7-8 years, and the conversation is broadly still the same. Yes, ChatGPT has brought AI to the forefront of everyone's mind, more so than any other development in the last 10 years, because of the ability for an AI, i.e. a large language model capability, to have indexed so much of the internet and then return you an answer. As it relates to volunteering, that's probably a podcast in its own right. In the short term, many volunteering opportunities would only be taken over by a robot because they're physical and you're out there doing stuff, and they also inherently require human to human interaction. The areas that we all know about, most people who haven't been living under a rock for the last 5 years know that AI is trying to replicate a lot of what humans do, whether that's sound like a human, talk like a human, in terms of the audio capability, or create like a human, which can also be creating music or video and etc., or incredibly knowledgeable. As it relates to volunteering, I think that I'm not sure whether it's a major threat right now, and you can cut this stuff out of the podcast if I'm going to be argued otherwise. But I don't think it's not something I have really thought about yet. There is a generic theme around artificial intelligence and how it will automate away a few, quite more than a few, sort of low-level service jobs in certain areas. And it's already starting to happen a little bit from a customer service point of view, from a bit of content creation point of view, dare I say it. But I don't think I think from a volunteering point of view, it's not something I've really thought we need to worry about yet. is my opinion.
I'm thinking about it from two perspectives, one from the volunteering side and one from the management side. And so from the volunteering side, actually, there's a lot of things that volunteers are doing that I know volunteers can't find enjoyable. And I know we put it out there because we don't want staff to do it, right? We see a lot of admin roles on our platform, for example. Does anyone enjoy admin? I'm not too sure. Maybe they do. But, these are the types of things that could be optimized away. Actually, if anything, I'm really positive about volunteering as a whole. Why? Because if this big wider trend of AI kind of plays out, people are going to be more time rich, right? We might move to 4 or 3 day working weeks, and that's great. And we're also moving to a world of less connections in real life. So volunteering fills that gap really well, right? And it builds a sense of community. So I'm really positive about the future for volunteering. I only think it's going to get more prevalent, in my opinion. But from the management side, I wouldn't be too worried remote because of the fact that, let's be honest, I'm afraid the third sector will probably be one of the last ones to the party, right? Because of the red tape, because of the fear and all that kind of stuff. However, right, what I always think about tech is we always get asked, right, like, oh, does this make volunteering really transactional? Does it remove the human part? If we save all this time, we then have to cut staff, and we're essentially saying, no, none of these things, right? None of these things necessarily, right? What we're saying is, actually, what's all this 50% of your time spent on very low value add work that could be dealt with by some other means, right? Particularly things like AI, right? And we're looking at things in how we can manage in Volunteero, right? We see lots of time being spent writing out, what this event is going to be in details and writing out volunteering roles. And we think, can we just, integrate into ChatGPT so people can just create that on the fly, right? Now, that's not reducing value for anyone. If anything, it's just giving you a bucket load of time back to focus on the things where you add value where AI maybe cannot, right? Those personal connections, building better relationships, figuring out how we can improve the program as a whole. These are the things they should be spending their time on. So I can only see it as a good thing. And I think if I had any kind of advice to give to kind of volunteer managers, is be the front runner in that regard, right? Get yourself accustomed to using these tools in some capacity, because, if there is fears that it's going to have a significant impact, well, guess what? You certainly want to be the one in the organization that's used to leveraging that sort of technology, right? So that's my thoughts, at least.
Yeah, I totally agree with both you guys. And almost actually back to what we said earlier on, in a sense that, well, actually, staff don't like doing admin either, for starters. And I meet so many volunteer managers who spend way too much time administering paperwork. And what they really want to do, as you say, Ash, they're people. They're experts in many ways in human behaviour. They want to be doing what I said, I think, about 10 minutes ago, which is about curating the experiences. And if the more we can free up the human element of volunteer managers to use their talents in that arena, the better. So, yeah, great. Well, I think on this podcast, we're usually glass half full anyway, but we had to ask the question. And let's end with a positive one, really, which is what are the next big developments that you see on the horizon for volunteering and digital? So, your chance to be kind of futurologists in this space. What have we got to look forward to?
I'd say from my side, I think it's quite easy to probably kind of predict the future because it's kind of happened in the private sector, right? And I think sort of more dedicated tools are coming in. I'm seeing them pop up, and I'm sure, Chris, Matt, you've seen much the same. Dedicated tools really focus for volunteering, and then hopefully an API first world, which for those who aren't kind of techie, just a way to connect all of your tools together. Because the worst thing that most organizations struggle with is they've got these fragmented systems that don't talk to each other, and that admin we talked about is just often moving data and stuff between the two, right? And I think, or I can also talk from the volunteering perspective, and at least what we're doing. Again, we're really, people we hope people think, and we know people think of us as sort of disruptive and innovative. But again, if anything, we're just taking kind of best practice from things that have happened, right? We're just bringing in things we know work elsewhere. Matt said references. Well, we got a system that collects your references. Anything that you spend time on a day-to-day basis, we're going to optimize. And then from the Volunteero experience, we're taking, best practice from Duolingo, the app, right? We now gamify and provide you, badges delivered for your volunteering milestones. We provide, safe and secure chat rooms, instant messaging for a better way to connect with your other fellow volunteers and feel, part of the team. So we're kind of just bringing in a lot of things that we see from these different tools that are being leveraged, but into a dedicated solution for volunteering. I think when you kind of add all those various time savings and things up, there's going to be a massive time saving. Staff are going to be more happy with their day-to-day job because they're going to be doing the things that they enjoy doing. And volunteers who, let's be honest, spend most of their time on their phone and it's very important for them, I think they're going to feel much more like they can contribute in the way that they want to going forward because it's right there in the palm of their hand. And that's what we're really focused on at the moment.
Marvelous.
I'll add, second a couple of things you just said, Ash. Software as it is, and there is a lot of legacy software out there, and creating an API on top of these different disparate things is happening, more and more often. It doesn't mean that you've got to rebuild everything as long as you can access it and pull it in or push it out. The more people embrace that, the API economy, as it was coined about 10 years ago, that has happened in the private sector and it is happening in this sector, then it's going to allow people to access their existing data in places they haven't managed to bring it all together really, really quickly, quite frankly. To the point about, I guess, actually talking to what you've built, it's great to hear. It's a bit sort of Steve Jobs-esque. I think it was his line, start with the people first and then work back to the technology. It's not like you're saying, okay, the technology can do this, so let's get that hammer out and smash that nut. It's like you're working with the problem and working back to the technology, and that's just got to keep on happening. But I think there's also this education point in charity sector more than anything else is about what technology can do, a bit of the art of the possible, but always through the lens of why. What do the people need it to do? And actually, again, kind of talking a bit about sort of like the areas I talk to and work in around AI, but the safe side of it, or maybe the data manipulation or the data aggregation and understanding. It's incredible what models can do these days in terms of learning models, machine learning models that can look at data and sort of extract the right information out of that data. Is powerful, quite frankly. So if you've got a lot of disparate systems and a lot of duplication and a lot of mess, there's a job to be done there. But once you get that in good order, which will happen, then you can do some very, very clever things, quite frankly. So I think there's a lot to come generally in the digital space in the sector, where these technologies become cheaper to run, easy to access via APIs, and you can do some great stuff with them. And yeah, there's a heck of a lot going on in the private sector all the time. That idea of creating job roles or summarizing documents or doing this, doing that, it's just becoming easier and easier to do. And the models are becoming better, and there are safe ways of doing it. And those things literally didn't exist 2 years ago. So I think there's a need for, I guess, geeks like me and probably you to probably invade the space a bit more, maybe at a board level, to talk about these things.
Yes, so it's lots to look forward on the technology front. The challenge remains probably outside the technology front. It remains in the hearts and minds, the culture change and the organisational development space to make sure we carve out room for volunteering and technology together to take that forward. Well, so thank you so much, guys. This has been the most fascinating conversation I'm sure that listeners will be equally infused and hopefully taking some of the thinking back to their executives, back to their boards, back into their teams, spending some time reflecting on their own practice and thinking, well, how can we enhance our volunteering activity and planning with a little bit more of a digital mindset going forward? If they want to get in touch with either of you, how what's the best way to get in touch?
I'm on LinkedIn, Ashley Staines, and our kind of Volunteero is just spelt volunteer with an O at the end. So you can find our website and get in touch there, which is volunteero.org. So yeah, we encourage anyone to get in touch, whether you're looking for tech or not. Regardless, we actually just love to have any conversations about volunteering, full stop.
So you can contact me, Doug Ayres, on LinkedIn as well, and you can find me and the team on EBM.AI. I do feel like Ash has got a lot of this covered, so he's your volunteering guy from a tech point of view. But if you're thinking about digital assistance and chatbot technology and some integration with volunteering, Volunteero or volunteering platforms, then yeah, get in touch.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very much for that and for being so generous with your time this evening. We've gone well over the time that we said we would, and we're incredibly grateful to both of you. Thanks very much.
Absolutely.
So, Matt, wow, that was an amazing conversation with some, very wide-ranging insights over such a range of different subjects. They were so generous with their time. But I wonder, what were your reflections? It felt that there was so much to learn for us as volunteer professionals.
Yeah, I think a huge amount to learn. And to be honest, I think it'll probably take me a bit of time for all of that to sink in, really, because I think there's a lot to think about there. From where we're going with AI to investment to whether there's a digital divide or not, to how we convince people to invest in this or get behind it, overcoming some of the barriers and red tape, a huge amount to think about. I guess the biggest takeaway for me at the moment, and maybe this is kind of pertinent to, I guess, where we go with this podcast sometimes, but what struck me a lot about the two people we've just spoken to is they are people who think differently, and they're people who are looking at problems and looking to sort of non-traditional areas as to where we can find solutions, and they've got their eyes on all kinds of different areas inside the sector, outside the sector, and that's really interesting. And I think maybe that's the challenge for us, which is how can we think more like that? I think not all of us and not everyone will be in an organization that has the luxury of investing in digital in scale or in all the ways they want to. But I think something we can all take away is how can we think differently? How can we think outside the box? How can we take what the customer's needs are first and work backwards from there? I think to me, all of those things are things that we can all do, and maybe start doing from now. That's my big takeaway.
Yeah, 100% agree, Matt. The digital stuff is fascinating in itself, but the cultural thinking, the mindset, the entrepreneurial startup mindset, I think we can learn as much from that as we can from the digital solutions themselves. And I think that's a challenge for us as professionals to think about how we can shake things up and look at things from different perspectives, in particular, of course, from both the customer, i.e. the volunteer, but also from the chief exec and the board's perspective, and speak the cultural intelligence of speaking the same language as some of those people as well. Wow. Anyway, lots to take in. I'm sure listeners will take away their own perspectives as well, and always interested to have comments if people want to write into us. You can contact us. There's a comment section on the podcast itself in the show notes. Always love to hear from you, or you can get in touch with our website, www.timeforimpact.co.uk, and we love to hear from you. And as always, please do follow, please do rate us, and if you have interesting stories to tell or guests that you think we should speak to, you know where to find us. Until next time, thanks very much. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Chris. Bye-bye.
Bye.
you.